So we are live. Good evening, Nick. I hope you are well.
Good evening, Kate. I'm very well, thank you.
So firstly, I'd like to thank Chris for giving me his channel to utilize for this evening. He's away in Serbia visiting a young lady, so he can't be there this evening. But it's great to finally get to speak to you. Man who's got much experience of navigating the political world, and especially within nationalism. So I wanted to pick your brains. I'm a solutions-based person, and I think that you probably are too.
I certainly try to be, yeah.
So I came across a document of yours, No Electoral Route, and I found that quite interesting. I believe in a multiple operational strategy, and I can see the pessimism. I was involved in party politics for some time myself, but I wanted to pick up on a couple of points that are contained within it. I mean, really, we could spend all evening talking about this document because there is so many things that we could pick up upon. But overall, the gist of it is that there isn't an electoral route and we should be looking to other means.
That's the gist of it. I'll say right from the start that it doesn't mean that there is no place for politics. I think certainly at local level, certainly at parish council levels, any level where there's no money involved for a councillor means the other parties aren't interested. That then makes it possible and feasible. And we had to be rooted in our community. So to be involved in a local council level, really local, that I think is something very worthwhile, very valid. But the minute people start to talk about, when we come to power, so our job now is to write the manifesto, and in due course the people will wake up and there'll be a great breakthrough. You are talking, well, the working title of the document, which was actually Tooth Fairy Politics, and it's the level of believing in Father Christmas and the Tooth Fairy. It's very nice, but
well, younger generations, I mean, myself, I'm full of optimism. I'm always one of these people that believes we can reverse it. I mean, I've been involved with the UK Independence Party. In 2015, we got 3.5 million votes and returned one person to Parliament. And that was when it struck me personally that we don't really live in a democracy. And it doesn't matter how hard you campaign. I mean, UKIP, it took them 25 years and much hard work and some help, I would say, from the powers that be to be able to get to a position to bring about the referendum. And seeing that dedication and hard work that people put in, I mean, you get some activists that will be out every weekend or deliver leaflets in the rain. They will spend the money that they have on activism rather than things like family, because they truly believe that that party is going to be able to turn things around. And I think looking at British politics throughout time, like it was something you were talking about inside the document. It was about how nationalism, as much as we can see, especially since COVID, many people don't quite trust the government like they did. If we look historically, nationalism was much stronger in this country previously. I mean, you talked about the dock workers turning out for Enoch Powell. You talked about the success that the British National Party had, that the National Front had. And, it seems that nationalism has been pushed into the dark corners of politics. And even if people agree with us, the climate now is so different. I mean, even expressing your views gets you fired. I mean, it probably had its persecution problems in the day, but what are your thoughts on it? Because people seem to be very optimistic, especially with all the protests that are going on, and thinking that the general public is starting to notice that they're being replaced. So,
well, there's many sort of questions and thoughts from that, Kate. First of all, I'm not in the least bit pessimistic. I'm less pessimistic now than I've ever been, because I have absolutely no doubt that the fundamental problem is that the system, which is a very evil system, has nevertheless delivered the goods. It's given people in living memory, it's taken people from no cars, no fridges, no food in the larder, no foreign holidays, none of this, to an incredible standard of living. And while that system was trundling along, and nationalists like the far left as well always used to say, well, one day there'll be a collapse, but it was harder and harder to see where this was coming. This thing just seemed to be going on forever. And without a drastic failing of the system that delivers the goods, there's no prospect of people waking up from the liberalism, turning around and doing anything worthwhile. But now, the more and more I look at it, the more I see of the people now running the system. They are so crazed that it's not that the system will collapse. They are going to collapse it. You know, the old Communist Party, their beef, at least theoretically, with the capitalists was over who would control the means of production. That was what it was all about, in theory. But what we're dealing with now is an elite which is determined to destroy the means of production and the means of electricity, just everything. So when you consider the damage the communists did with their unrealistic egalitarian fantasy, just trying to change who owns the means of production, distribution and exchange, now you consider or understand we have an elite worldwide hell-bent on destroying it. You know that this system is going to collapse under the weight of its own folly, added to which we're now in the phase which we weren't 20, 30 years ago. Some of us saw it coming, but we're now in the phase of demographic collapse, which is accelerating so quickly and it's so inexorable, there is no possibility of the capitalist consumer society surviving it. Therefore, there is going to be enormous, huge change, and liberalism will lose its death grip upon us all. So I'm more convinced of that now than ever. So I'm very optimistic, but I am extremely realistic about the electoral road. And as that document says, there is no electoral road, and it sets it out in a number of, for a number of reasons. But I pick up on one thing he said. You're absolutely right talking about the sacrifice that you saw, of the activists of UKIP. But I can tell you absolute for certainty, because I've known a lot of people in UKIP at different stages, and the activists of UKIP never had anything in terms of pain and suffering and hardship and sacrifice on the scale that the activists, first of all, of Mosley's movement, then of the National Front, and then of the British National Party. It was in a totally different league what our people put up with. And under the circumstances, we achieved great, amazing things. But one of the most important things we achieved was to make it very, very clear that the electoral road is slammed shut, not least because when nationalism was stronger, and it wasn't just in Britain, it was Jean-Marie Le Pen in France, the NPD in Germany, various Italians and so on. It was because there was a time in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, even to the 2000s, when all the collective elite of Europe, they all work together and they copy each other's strategies very, very closely. They train each other, teach each other in how to deal with problems, overcome opponents and so on. And there was a long time in which they thought the way to deal with us was just calling us fascist, extremist monsters and giving people the choice between voting for them or voting for the fascist, extremist monsters, which worked to a degree, but it was getting to the stage where it wasn't working, because all it was telling an increasing minority of the public who were utterly sick of politicians was that these were people who were different. We were something very different. Otherwise, why would the others hate us so much? And although it was putting off sort of the soft, silly middle classes in many areas, it wasn't putting off people who were really up against it. And in fact, it was becoming a recruiter for us. So we were growing on that basis all over Europe, and we became a serious threat, with probably Golden Dawn becoming the most serious. But at that point, they discovered that they said, well, we have to deal with this a different way. And they discovered quite simply that rather than taking on the fash head on, it was far more effective to take a softer civic nationalist type protest movement of some sort or other, which is there in its own right. Usually middle class people who don't like the opprobrium of being accused of racism and fascism, and having tough lads around to protect your activities from the far left, which is an essential. So the people worried about the optics, the people worried about the optics, and the people worried about respectability all set up these soft, kosher sort of parties, and any one of them can be taken and promoted by the elite as a safety valve. And the public, time and time again, I've seen it repeatedly and I've spoken to nationalists all over Europe, we all found the same thing, that people who were voting for us previously, when you knocked on a door again or met them in the street again, they said, you're absolutely great and wonderful, but the others, in Britain's case, UKIP, with respect to your good self, who I joined later than this probably, they're the ones who are going to win. They do it a little bit cleverer, they get a bit more slack from the media. So actually I prefer you, but we've got to vote for them. And all my friends are doing the same. And once they discovered that trick, it's the final kiss of death for the idea that there's an electoral road to power for a genuine nationalist movement. which isn't mean to say there's nothing we can do, far from it.
No, I do think that without the BNP, UKIP would not have been able to do what it did. I think that two-party play, in many ways, was how UKIP managed to be like, oh, we're not the racists, we're not the extremists, we just want our sovereignty back. You know, let's not concentrate on colour. Let's talk about immigrants in general. I remember one of the lines throughout the referendum was that they'd say to black and brown people, this was quite common, was, well, you know, there might be less people allowed to just white people that are just allowed to come because they're part of the EU. But it means that more skilled people from everywhere around the world will be able to come. So it's less racist. It's less racist than what we've got now. So, yeah, there was definitely an element.
Certainly that. Well, I can tell you, Kate, that we have people very high up in UKIP, both in terms of people who knew Alan Scared in the early days, and then people even on the national executive in the middle to late 90s. Andrew Moffat was one. You may have come across him down south and so on. He was a candidate for UKIP, later a candidate for us and so on. But these people were very much in touch with what was going on at the centre of UKIP in the mid-2000s. And there's no shadow of a doubt that Farage had a meeting with key BBC executives at this stage. I don't know the exact date, but he had a meeting with them in which it was agreed that they would promote him and UKIP in order to block the British National Party. That was the only reason. You got to remember that from 2001 through to 2014, in fact, but particularly 2001 through to 2010, there wasn't a single election in which the threat to the British National Party wasn't a major sub-story within the election as a whole. And we literally gave those people sleepless nights. We terrified them. The same is true in France with Jean-Marie and others, and elsewhere as well. And so they did this deal with Farage. They would promote him in UKIP on condition he was never to talk about immigration in terms of blacks and browns. He basically had free rein to create hostility to people from Eastern Europe, white Christian immigrants. But he wasn't to be racial. Of course, he wasn't to mention the JQ. That almost goes without saying.
That would never happen.
And so that was done, and that was why Farage had more than 24 appearances on Question Time.
Wow.
Between 2009 and 2014, when I had the one. And at that stage, although UKIP had far more votes and more MEPs, the BBC rules were very, very clear because they changed them repeatedly to keep the BNP out. Once upon a time, you just had to have an elected representative at parish council level would do. And every time we crossed the threshold, the BBC turned around and said, oh, we've changed it. We've moved the threshold up. And the final one was you have to have 2 MEPs or more, or people elected to a similar level. And duly we got that. And so did UKIP. Now, the fact that UKIP had, 10 or 12, whatever it was, made no difference. The BBC rules was 2 or more. And Farage and I should, under their own rules, have had equal amounts of time on Question Time. Twice a year, as guaranteed, plus once or twice more, perhaps, when it was our issue. So when, for instance, an EU story came up, it should have been Farage. When it was Grooming Gang story, considering they tried to put me in prison for it twice, for talking about it, it should have been me. But Farage was the one on constantly. They even put him on things like, have I got news for you, and so on, in order to legitimise them. And this is from the BBC, which, as you know, is radically and rabidly pro-EU and anti-anything remotely nationalist. But they promoted Farage in that way in order to block the BNP. One thing before we move on about Question Time, by the way, there's a myth, which is very, very dangerous, and various of the nationalists who have taken their cues from people who, for one reason or another, in the cut and thrust of party politics in organisations, I fell out with, or they fell out with me. And they say, oh, Question Time, that they and the left say, Question Time, Nick Griffin's appearance was a disaster for him and the BNP. It was never the same after that. Now, the truth is that I've been on various shows and so on with Paxman and all the rest of it, but there was one quite long discussion program I've been on with a fellow called Tim Sebastian, who was the hard talk man. And I did a show with Tim Sebastian, which was just a slanging match. He was very aggressive. He's a horrible liberal left Jew, and there's me. And it was a real slanging match. And the feedback we got from that afterwards was terrible. that it's just, even if it was in the right, it was just bad-mannered, ill-tempered, horrible to watch. Nothing was said worthwhile. So we decided, myself and several other people decided, we've got to avoid that. So if I go on Question Time with my usual pugnacious self, it'll basically end up more or less in a brawl, and the public won't like it. So we made the decision to do something very different, which was to go on Question Time, be very calm and defensive, and get beaten up publicly, which I did. In the theory, and this was only a theory, that the British public have a thing about the underdog, and that the manifest unfairness of what was going to happen, the sheer scale of the unfairness, I wasn't, to be honest, expecting. I prepared for it to a degree by watching what happened when Gerry Adams, IRA commander, mass killer, was first on Question Time. And there was sort of a couple of questions about his past, and then they moved on to discuss transport and the banking crisis, all the rest of it. So slightly naively, perhaps, I thought it would be the same. But nevertheless, I went on there with a view to staying calm, being cool, and getting beaten up publicly by all those people, which duly happened, because we had a feeling it would activate the underdog button in the British public. And it did, because for all the tales from the left and various self-interested people, formerly from the party and so on, that it was some kind of disaster, what actually counts is the opinion polls. And until that Question Time, the British National Party had never been above 6% in any national opinion poll. That was the highest we'd ever got. 6% of the public saying they might vote for us. The week after Question Time, the opinion poll had us on 22%. Staggering, a more than threefold increase. So, and that was because the BBC let me talk. The first half was just hanging me, basically. In the second half, they let me talk a bit about race and immigration. They let me talk about Islam. They let me talk they pushed me to talk about the whole gay thing. And they felt they'd established that, there we are, I've proven it from my own mouth, that we're racist, fascist, homophobic and Islamophobic. And the consequences of that was we went up for that the following week to 22% in the poll. And that was why, for all the story that they say that when Griffin was allowed on and he explained his policies, and thereby the policies of every nationalist out there, basically, the public were horrified and they turned against it. Not true at all. The public liked what they saw, despite the fact it was a public lynching. So that's the reality. And again, it's another thing which shows us how difficult the electoral road is, that the BBC learned from that as well, because that is why Farage had more than 24 appearances in that 5-year period, and I only had the one. There's no platform for anyone like thee and me.
No, I've noticed this. When I was in the UK Independence Party, especially during the referendum, I did run the referendum campaign in Greater Manchester after the gentleman who was supposed to be doing so actually died. And because I had suspected that they were going to pull the referendum that quickly, I'd started gathering activists and setting up. So I was ready to go. And during that time, I got invited into the BBC studios in Manchester on numerous occasions, mostly to go on to the Victoria Derbyshire show. And I did notice that they're very clever at being able to set up questions and the program in a way to catch you off guard, to make you look silly, to get you a little bit agitated. I learned these tricks in a particular broadcast, but I noticed that as soon as Nigel Farage stood down after the referendum, once we had new party leaders and even we still had MEPs, it was very difficult to get any free and fair media exposure at all. I mean, I was considered far right within UKIP. I had to very much tone down my rhetoric. They wrote articles about me after I got onto the NEC, because I was a member of the National Executive for a number of years. And when I first got on, Hope Not Hate wrote a hit piece about me being anti-Semitic and racist. And I was, told by everybody that I must apologize, because they were kicking UKIP members out for sharing a post from Britain First, or if they shared any content relating to you whatsoever. That was it. You were expelled. You were expelled from the party. But once we got the referendum, and as much as I do feel that, Brexit was worth it, I don't feel that we got what we wanted. One, because we don't live in a democracy. I mean, we've told the government numerous times through democratic processes, no more foreigners. They keep bringing them in. There is no democratic accountability. But yes, I found that once I left party politics and the referendum was done, I had a brief stint in the Conservative Party, the whole get Brexit done thing.
Oh, dear. That's a black mark.
I worked with a lot of them during the referendum campaign, and they convinced me, get Boris Johnson into power, this whole Brexit thing will just be done with. It'll be done with, and he's better than the alternatives. So come and help us get him elected, because I'd had enough of the left trying to undermine that vote for years. It was the main topic on the news for a number of years after the vote, with them trying to undermine it. So I joined, and it was quite clear that I was not like them. Obviously, I got kicked out shortly after they got elected, because I was racist and anti-Semitic and homophobic and everything under the sun that they could label me with. But from there, I thought, you know what? There is no route through party politics. I don't have to tone myself down anymore. And even though I talked about grooming gangs and demographics and just a little bit about the JQ, but not too much, because, well, you realize that once you do that, that's it. You are cancelled from all platforms. That, you know, once you start pointing out who's behind it, you're in a different category politically. And like you say, what the persecution that UKIP members face, nothing like what nationalists face. I mean, look at people today. They're being sent to prison for owning books, being dragged before the courts for spicy things that they might have said on podcasts, making accusations that people's podcasts have incited terrorism in foreign countries and locking people away for it. I mean, you've been extensively persecuted yourself. You've now been banned from traveling. So it's not just media bans. These are things that affect your real day-to-day life. Things like your ability to gain employment, your personal safety, your ability to move, for your freedom of movement, to be able to go visit other people. If you had family abroad, you wouldn't be able to go see them. I mean, it's
it's across the board. It's, you know, people's businesses, people's livelihoods, bank accounts, everything is cancelled. You basically become a non-person in an increasingly digital state. To be deprived of the right to have digital access in the same way everybody else is makes it almost impossible to function. So the persecution and the capability of the state to persecute is getting even worse. The great news about this, I would say, is that to a degree it's difficult. We have to train ourselves, because you see a wrong, you want to talk about it, you want to tell people, you want to put it right. But I think we have to face it increasingly that if people don't already know that all these things are wrong, then either they are so monumentally stupid or twisted in their own heads they'll never get it right, or they know, most of them know, but they know there's a price for admitting it. They don't want to pay that price, so they bury their heads in the sand and pretend they haven't seen it. So our audience and our mission isn't to wake up people who haven't woken up already. Ours is simply to work with the people who have woken up, which now, thanks to the COVID scamdemic and the resistance to it, and the 15-minute cities, all the rest that's coming from the Great Reset, there's a huge minority of the public in this country and every other Western country who are now awake and deeply and intelligently suspicious of everything that's going on. We don't have to convince them that things are wrong. Our job is to involve them in parallel structures which one way or another will end up making things come right. So we don't need to talk about the problems. Talking about the problems is dangerous. You talk about whether it's grooming gangs, Islamist terrorism, the power of the Israeli lobby, the power of the deep state, the warmongers, all the rest of it, and you're going to be persecuted and liable to be sent to prison. People who say what you're saying in just one slightly more excitable way, in one slightly more radical way, you know, they're going to go down for a long, long time. So rather than doing that, we simply now need to be concentrating on quietly doing things with our people which will help them get through it. How I've characterized it, there's two books, by the way, in effect, which cover this. One of them, Deus Vult, the Great Reconquista of the West, is about the Reconquista of the West, handbook for resisting the Great Replacement. Second one, Deus Vult, the Great Reset Resistance. They're both available, by the way, on Amazon. So one of the key things in both those books is to say that our mission is not to, we're facing a deeply evil society thing that runs the show. Our job is not to overthrow it. We're not revolutionaries to overthrow it. It's going to collapse of its own accord. Our job is to endure it and to make sure that as many as possible, a faithful remnants and a conscious remnant of our people, get through the collapse, take their kids through the collapse with our culture, our values, our faith intact in them. That's our job. Don't worry about collapsing that society. It's rotten to the core. It's going to die in any case. We've got to survive, make sure our people survive the other end.
I agree. I think that you were talking about earlier on in the stream, you know, people couldn't see this great collapse happening, but now we're seeing it. I mean, you can see economic collapse happening worldwide. The global elite that seemed to used to be quite methodical and strategic have got so messy. It's almost like they've been brainwashed by their own psychological warfare and have invested themselves fully into what I call the cults. These, I know I talk a lot about the cults, but there's cults within globalism. I mean, you've got the cult of the rainbow flag, the LGBT alphabet mafia. That's one of the cults. And then you've got probably the most dangerous of all the cults, the climate cult, that seems to want to get us to net zero. You know, they want to chop down orchards for the environment, you know, make way for HS2. We're going to take down all your trees to make a bus lane. Everybody's got to pay extortionate energy bills. Eventually, they're going to shut down all industry. Where's our food going to come from? How are we going to transport it? You know, that bread and circuses that's kept the system going is going to collapse of its own accord because these people have lost their minds.
Yes.
They have actually lost their minds.
I think there's a lot of people out there, you know, they try to think, well, is it 3D chess or 6D chess or 72D chess? It's all planned. You know, everything's planned. Well, if people believe that, actually, then there's nothing you can do. So it's a very dangerous thing in any case. There
are people who have put these plans together and they are highly intelligent and they work together collaboratively as a group. But I do believe that they have gone power mad.
Exactly so.
From their own plans.
Exactly so. It's more than power mad. I think it's nature abhors a vacuum, including human nature. And human beings are hardwired for religiosity. Not everyone is religious, but most people have hardwiring for religiosity when under stress. And actually being at the top of anything is a very stressful situation. So these people are hardwired for religiosity. So the people who ran the show, say in the 1960s, or even a little bit earlier, when especially the Labour Party in Britain, but similar organisations around Europe and certain ethno-religious grouplets decided that they were going to get rid of the peoples of Europe. Yes. So when they started that, the people running the show, nevertheless, came primarily, the whole of society came from a Christian background. And they weren't necessarily particularly Christian by this stage, but even a lot of people in the Labour Party, Harold Wilson's era and so on, a lot of them were Methodists. They were hardcore leftist Christians from a genuinely Christian background. So they had that backdrop, the remnant of a Christian faith, which filled their need for religiosity. Then they just got on with their lives and did politics. The ones who are now in charge are completely post-Christian. So there's a complete vacuum in the bit of their brain or soul which demands a religiosity. And Chesterton said that if people cease to believe in God, they don't believe in nothing, they'll believe in anything. Chesterton was very, very wise. And that absolutely sums it up, that because these people have this spiritual vacuum, it's filled by, as you say, cults. And therefore we're dealing with an elite which is immensely clever, immensely powerful, immensely ruthless, immensely rich, but also immensely confused and stupefied by the nonsense ideas and these resurrected archetypes like Gaia, the earth goddess from Neolithic times and so on, now reborn. This is the sort of nonsense that fill their heads. And if you look for logic, and you expect the logical thing for them to do is to keep us all basically happy in order to keep their power untouched, and then get on with what they're trying to do to get rid of us, slower. But it's completely illogical because, as you say, they have lost their minds, and it's fascinating to see, isn't it?
It's fascinating to see, though. Even watching society as a whole, when it comes to living standards, I know you were saying that living standards have got exponentially better, but over the last few decades, I mean, it's like my mother. She bought her first house while she was still training for her main profession. She had my older sister who was still a baby. Her and my dad broke up. She could afford that mortgage on her own with a child as a single mum. And I believe the house cost her £18,000. And that was in like 1989. That same house now, I think, is near 200 and something grand because it's a 3-bedroom detached house with a garden. And even though it's in an area that's been diversified, the house prices have gone up exponentially. Yeah. My generation are going to struggle to buy homes. The next generation are not going to be able to afford them, whilst Africans are getting them built for free off our taxes, Pakistanis and Afghanis. I mean, even now, there are people struggling to heat their homes, to feed themselves. People are completely caught up in this good goy tax system. And I wonder, how low will they allow certain standards to slip? I mean, you know what bothers me is looking to South Africa, because I believe this is the model that they want for all white Europeans. You know, we'll flood you full of black and brown people, we'll claim that they're the victims that are oppressed, we'll overthrow all white rules, subject you to genocide. But if people don't see people getting rounded up and mass killings, they don't think it's a genocide, because the Jews have made them believe that the only way that genocide happens is the Holocaust. You know, people get shoved on trains and get gassed. They don't know about the Holodomor. They don't know about the Christians that have been murdered by the Ottoman Empire. You know, they only think about genocide in one way, and they don't think about it in the way of population replacement. And I think they'll put up with a lack of standards. I think they'll keep putting up with all these immigrants. And like you say, a lot of them, I think, depend on this capitalist system. You know, as much as I think people are aware that the system is rotten to its core, people are not offering a viable alternative. And I think that's why nationalists struggle with the electorate, not just because the system is very unfair and unbalanced and doesn't really give the opportunity for them to make informed choices, but I think the system as a whole is well recognized as being rotten to the core by most people, but yet they don't know what to do about it. And the situation, even though it keeps getting worse, there is no other alternative, and they're too scared to speak because, like you say, once you point out the monster in the room, they think it's going to recognize them and come for them.
I think that how low can it go? How bad can it get? In material terms, it's going to get a lot worse. And they, as in the elite, will happily let it get as bad as it can get, unless and until they meet a very harsh resistance. So whether the public, and it's interesting that 1 million girls gang raped, and basically nobody did anything. Not even the dads and the brothers did anything.
Nobody's done anything.
But you take away people's right to drive their Chelsea taxi down the next street along, and start fining them for it and blocking their roads off. And even the respectable, utterly liberal middle class in places like Oxford are basically up in arms and start burning things down. So you never know what is going to trigger a people who are deeply materialistic. And it could be something quite minor, creates an enormous political reaction, which is good to a degree. But I come back to the point that it's irrelevant anyway, because all these liberals, everyone in the society, we're all going to die, but they're going to die childless. Statistically, almost all the liberals are going to die childless or with one child. That's it. The average Brit, we theoretically are at 1.8 children per woman of childbearing age. That's the British average. Nonsense it is. That's the average of the featherless bipeds that currently live in Britain. The average of our people will be the same as in Portugal, Greece, and all the rest of it. And in parts of Eastern Europe, it's about 0.9, 0.8, 0.9. So our population is going to crash. It's going to halve in the next 30, 40 years, and it'll be crashing again after that. And as for the immigrants, most of them, actually, the minute they've been here a few years, they adapt themselves, and because they also have to pay for these ridiculously expensive houses and to pay all the tax and all the rest of it. So 2 parents working can just about afford to keep a roof, to get a roof over their heads, and can just about afford to have a child. They can't really afford to have any more than that. So demographically, this system is eating itself and it's doomed. But it doesn't matter. What matters is who's going to be there in 2-3 generations' time. And that depends on quite small numbers of people now, because huge changes in demographics very often occur because a small number of people basically just believe that it's their God-given duty to breed like rabbits. And there's only one predictor of large families in the world, and that's religiosity. And you look at the Orthodox Jews. When I was a lad in Barnet, North London, there was one tiny little bit of Stamford Hill, which my dad used to take me through occasionally in a car journey, and a few streets had these ringleted Orthodox Jews. That was it. There weren't any others. Now they dominate vast areas of North London because they've had 3 generations. It's about 24, 25 years as a breeding generation. And they've been rapidly breeding 8, 9 kids each for those generations. Their populations exploded. The fastest breeders in the world are the Christian Amish and the Mennonites in various parts of the USA and South America. And of course, you've also got in the Islamic world, the birth rates in Tunisia, Morocco, and so on, they're crashing now. They're not that far behind us in terms of their commitment to capitalism, consumerism, and death. But the Islamist extremists, the hardcore, the fundamentalists, are breeding as fast as any other religious group does. And the people who breed will be the ones who will inherit the future. It's as simple as that. But even if our people stick to their low birth rate, we're not going to, I agree with you entirely to a degree, so the South Africa is the model, it's the end game. But the Boers were always a small minority. White South Africa was bigger, but there was a division between the Boers and basically the Brits. And as soon as it all went wrong, almost all the Brits, of course, had left. But the Boers were always a small minority. And so they've now reached the stage when they're so small they can't even defend themselves. But whatever happens in Britain, our people will be the largest minority for several generations. Simple as that. Once they are a minority, we're as a majority, we're already paying for all the rest in terms of taxes. But once you're a minority, so the pressure really comes on, then inevitably that will beat the liberalism out of people. And if you want to see the future of Britain and our people in Britain, just look at Ireland and Northern Ireland. And I'm not taking any sides in the issue of the communities, Catholic, Protestant, and all the rest of it. You don't need to. The bare facts are enough that the Protestant loyalists in Ireland were always a minority. And while they did horrible things to the other side, they were frequently, on a number of occasions, especially in the 1640s, they were genocided on a brutal and staggering scale, balanced by the famine tragedy later on, which primarily hit the Catholics, but also the Presbyterians particularly. But anyway, the fact is that Ulster loyalists were always a minority in the Isle of Ireland. For a short time, in historical terms, after 1922, they became the majority in the majority of the state of Northern Ireland. But even in parts of that, they were always the minority. They were the minority in South Armagh, for instance. They were the minority in Fermanagh. So as a population in their heads, they've always been a minority. And now they're a minority again. But I was over in Northern Ireland just the other week, and I've never seen the loyalist parades as strong and as vibrant, with as many young people and with such skills and commitment and organisation as in the past. They're streets ahead of where they were in the Troubles in the 1980s. So the more they, again, now go back to being a minority, the more it makes them cohesive and the more they organise. And our job isn't to persuade our people, come back to it, that it's wrong to become a minority. It's going to happen anyway. Our job is to give a lead vanguard of our people some of the tools and the ideas, first the ideas, then the tools, that they need to be an effective, organised minority which can stand up for its own rights. Something that I'm very much involved with now, and we're establishing a proper building and base over in Northern Ireland, is because that place is where every young nationalist in the British Isles should go and spend some time to see how two communities, both Catholic and Protestant, Loyalist and Republican, at different stages under the cosh, in the minority and being brutally oppressed, to see how both those communities have organised to build themselves unity and cohesion and to stand their ground. I'm not talking about bombs and bullets and any of the rest of the Marxist nonsense that came out of the IRA in the recent Troubles. I'm talking about everything from the Gaelic Football Association on one side through to the loyalist bands on the other. These are things which, if our people were doing that, I'll tell you, if in a Rotherham or an Oldham or somewhere like that, if the local white community, working class white community, could put out on the streets 3 or 4 bands, such as their equivalents in the roughest parts of Belfast, put out on the street, the groomers would never have touched any of those girls, because the message of those bands is, yeah, here you've got 50, 60, 100 young men marching with flutes and drums, but they're marching in line in a skill which nowadays puts the British Army to shame, not that that's that difficult anymore. And if they can do that just to play music, what can they do if they're angry? And if they're no longer carrying drums flutes and fifes, but they're carrying baseball bats? Don't mess with that community is the message it sends out. Therefore, no one does mess with that community.
Well, we have seen a little bit of that. In Ireland, we've seen increasingly the local indigenous
Yep.
communities there, whether Protestant or Catholic, have been banding together
Yeah.
because women and men and children are being sexually assaulted on a very large scale and being attacked by these foreign invasive people that they've invited into Ireland. And you see that there is a much stronger local community cohesion
Yeah.
within these indigenous groups there.
Yes.
So I think we're missing this very much in Great Britain. And as you were saying with the no electoral route, I do think there is a place, like you say, for party politics. Trying to fight general elections is going to be a massive waste of your money
Yeah.
and time. But when it comes to local politics, to what I call street movements, to what we're seeing
Yes.
arise with local communities coming together in places like Cannock, in Hull, in
Hmm.
Skegness, and opposing what's going on in Dover. I think
Absolutely.
that this is creating a stronger sense of community cohesion because people are starting to realize that they are being attacked.
Yeah.
As
It's
much as
it's
we
it's it's
please,
starting the beginning of the potential to put things right. The danger is that these, especially where these groups perhaps have a degree of success, but whether they do or not, they create a cohesion, they create an amorphous organization, and then people will come along and say, well, join my party or join this party or form your own party and take the old parties on, get elected, we'll take over the council, then we'll get a seat, and you go down this, it's a mission creep. And at the end of it, you're fighting every seat in the general election. You're losing your deposit in nearly all of them, and your people are absolutely shattered and demoralised for another 3 or 4 years when the whole sorry cycle starts up again. But taking the sort of things that are going on in places like Hull now, and again looking at Northern Ireland, where I was over there the other week, I was taken by my colleague into a local charity shop. Just you know how it is. Any high street has 5 or 6 empty shops, and it's got 4 or 5 charity shops. That's the state of them. So the shops are cheap enough, easy enough to come by. So the others, this being Loyalist Northern Ireland, there's one for Oxfam and one for some other Christian group, and one for helping the poor third world or somewhere else, all the rest of it. But one of them in this town is a local charity shop, and in the back of it, it's got a boxing ring and a gym. So the charity shop just raises money to make sure that local kids who want to can not hang around the streets causing trouble, but can do some martial arts. So it's completely self-funded, completely supported by local people, and obviously people who either have kids or don't like the idea of kids running wild, or are sick and tired of seeing money, whether it's tax money or their own money, going to the third world. There's a significant number of those people, and they would rather give their things from that they no longer need in their house or granny's house or whatever. They'd rather give it to that charity. And there's no earthly reason. A political party like the BNP or anyone else now couldn't do it, because you have all the usual leftists and so on would crash in and stop it. But if a group of local people took on a local shop and did that, then if the local state, the local Labour Party or whatever, turned on them to force the closure of that shop, all it would do would radicalise them further and make them all the more cohesive and determined to do something useful.
how
So
would they stop inclusivity invasion? I mean, you can set up, like, let's say if you've got you set up a community centre of sorts. You know that these people of foreign origin do not believe that anything should be exclusively ours.
Mhm.
They can have their exclusive charities, their exclusive centres. I mean, not that far away from me, there's a Bangladeshi women's centre. There's a Pakistani centre. There's all these centres for people. There's an African
Yep.
centre. And they're all their own community centres. If we set one up that was like, oh, okay, so we're setting up a community centre, I guarantee you that it'll have to be inclusive. It'll have
No,
to include all the
no, it wouldn't.
Africans, the
It
Arabs,
wouldn't
the
have. You have
Asians.
to be careful how you do things. But for instance, if you don't want Muslims or Jews, then your sessions all start with the Lord's Prayer. That's it. They will not come. It depends on what sort of music you play. If you play rap music, you'll get the sort of creatures who like rap music. But a short burst of classical music or English folk music is like kryptonite to those people. They run away from it. They won't go near it. you can make it very, very clear. You can also, you have to look very carefully at the charity rules and so on. Basically, they've given the impression that our people cannot form charities for our sole use. It's not true. If a charity from the very beginning is established for the benefit of local people in Hull, for instance, then there's nothing that any level of the state can do against it. If a charity is formed with some very amorphous, soft name, the sort of thing that nationalists, being too clever by half, would probably do, and is established, and then it turns around and said, oh, we're only for local Hull people, then it'll be closed down. But if you look seriously and properly at these things and go about it the right way, then there's nothing they can do. In the end, if a hostile outside force is going to gate crash you, well, if that was a bunch of internet-based Nietzschean supermen, none of them weighing over 9 stone, it'd be disaster. If they try that in a working class area in Hull, the incomers will get their asses kicked. Simple as. It'll only have to happen once.
Well, I have just set up, but it's still in its foundational phases because it's so multi-operational and complex. But I'm setting up an organisation called the White Indigenous Rights Alliance. It's a community interest company, and it's the sole beneficiaries are the white Indigenous peoples of Great Britain. And I've checked with all the right governmental authorities, and they've said, yeah, you can have this. I mean, there are plenty of, thousands of charities that are set up for the sole interests of certain racial, ethnic, national groups residing in Britain. There is nothing specifically for white people. Nothing.
Yep, exactly. So I think there's something in the back of my mind which the white issue is potentially a problem. But the minute you break it down more than that, and let's face it, you're not worried about white people in Hull, you're worried about local Hull people. The fact they all happen to be white is sort of coincidental and very helpful. And again, the moment you say white, instantly then if you've got mass media attention, it's a red rag to a bull, isn't it?
I want the mass media
attention. Telling some of the public, it may be useful for you to get other people to come on board to have publicity. You might need that. But I would say that for the real grassroots stuff, our people with our ideas trying to do positive things need to go beneath the radar. See if there's a hint, the minute I say when I'm talking about a boxing ring and so on, if there's a hint of any connection between even basic schoolboy level martial arts and a political cause, then you're looking at serious jail time. Under those circumstances, the word white is a really bad idea. Whereas,
the black people
whereas something which is just for local people, or the English, English is fine, or Welsh or Scottish or Irish, or Yorkshire, all of that's fine. But white is provocative, and there's a reason to be provocative certain times, and a good reason for publicity and to bring people in and so on. But if you're really aiming to build serious roots, which the state either won't notice or daren't try to crush, then you need to avoid provocations like that.
They're not going to like this organization as much as it has. It is a community interest company. Part of what it does in the Our Rights division is I'm planning to become a designated body for police super complaints. I don't know whether I'll get that, but we are going to have our own investigations and litigations department. I mean, I'm planning to use lawfare to take people on who are within the state, whether that be governmental officials or the state itself, or challenge things with a judicial review. Bring private
exactly. So you probably know, have you any idea how much it costs a piece of the state bureaucracy to defend even an opening letter for judicial review?
That thousands.
It's about 20,000 quid a few years ago. So a technique like that, it's I've had it described as illegal rioting. Basically, if they won't give us our rights, we're going to riot. But a riot which would cost them £20,000 in criminal damage would also lead to a lot of our people being put in prison, probably deservedly so, because they're only smashing up their own area, basically, and there's certainly not going to be a lot of sympathy from ordinary people around them. But a legal riot, which costs the council £20,000, and then you simply walk away from it, because you don't want to get embedded, embroiled in a massive court case with something whose legal resources are limitless and whose taxpayers' money is almost limitless. So you just take them so far and walk away. And that's a legal right. It's cost the bastards 20,000 quid. You can do that time and time and time again until they learn perhaps we ought to leave these people alone.
Yes, I found that litigation seems to be an effective means of making people behave themselves somewhat more. When they're aware that you can and will proceed with litigation against them, and they know it's not an empty threat, they start to behave a lot more. I found that. I'm currently in the midst of suing my former university for discrimination against me as a white student, racial harassment, racial victimization, and discrimination under the Equality Act, and breach of my right to freedom of expression. So that's been really interesting. I actually handed in some court documents today. I'm doing all the work myself because when I try to crowdfund, they wouldn't even approve my crowdfunding campaign. No lawyer or at all wanted to cover a white discrimination case. So I've been teaching myself along the way how to do it, and I found it really interesting. Judicial reviews are going to be much more very expensive, which is why I wanted an organization. But the problem is like I see it all the time with the left. I mean, they've got limitless money, like you say, but if there's a decision made by the governments, made by the courts, or made by some sort of body, if they don't like it, there's a judicial review instantly like this. Or it's even like, the foreign invasive people, the so-called refugees that are being put up in our hotel. It's like, if they're not happy with the conditions inside that hotel, suddenly they've got legal claims through the Home Office. Where are they getting the money for this? Where are they getting money for judicial reviews? These are supposed to be poor refugees that came here without anything. And I'm like, well, nobody's doing this for our people. And I see lawfare being used as a primary means of
absolutely
persecution against our people. So I want to use their own tools against them.
Yes. Yeah. And it's only, this isn't, some people watching this might think, oh, this is all theoretical, it's sort of fanciful. No. Robin Tilbrook's English Democrats, who are organisation, a thoroughly useless bunch of civic nationalists, good-hearted old chaps. But I think they've won 2 cases, the most important of which was against the Royal Armoury in Leeds, where they booked to hold a conference there. The Royal Armoury turned around and said, discovered who they were and said, oh, no, we're not having you. I think that cost the Royal Armoury, I think it was 10,000 quid or 12,000 quid in an out-of-court settlement, because Tilbrook's, he's a lawyer, took them straight to court. And having set the thing up right and carefully, so it's definitely within the definition of a protected characteristic, it's money for old rope, basically. You book somewhere and you hope they're going to throw you out because it's more money in the bank, and of course it shouldn't stay in the bank. It's lawfare money. It should go into the lawfare pot and then be used to go on the offensive, because there's so many things we can do. And in the end, the squeaky hinge tends to get the oil. When I was younger, my wife and I, young family, the only place we could afford a house large enough for a growing family was in rural mid Wales. So we ended up in a very Welsh speaking area, very committed to the Welsh language and so on, which incidentally is quite a good way to shut out others as a rule. And so I was heavily involved in that movement, keeping the local school open and so on. And I met a lot of people who'd been firebrands in the Welsh Language Society when they were younger. And out of a Welsh speaking population of less than 1 million, 6,000 young people went to prison in the civil rights struggle just to use their own language in a post office form or in court, or if arrested by the police and so on. And the British state didn't want to give way on that. 6,000 people had to go to prison, and many, many road signs had to be trashed and all the rest of it before they got their way. But they did get their way in the end. Now it'll be harder for us, and it's especially harder, again, to come back, if you're waving a really extremist flag in some way or another, whether it's some NS type thing or whether it's the word white even. The more offensive it is to a psychologically disturbed elite, the harder you're making it for yourself. Whereas if you can do the same thing in something which in a part of their brain they perceive as actually understandable and reasonable, they'll give way that much quicker. And our job isn't the fight. The fight is the means to the end. What we're after is results and successes. Sometimes to lose can be a success, like if you establish a shop in Hull in a working class area and the Labour Party in the end close it down. That would be a success. The process would be a learning curve by which the public have learned to be radicalised and are even more on your side than they were before. But a far bigger success to open the shop, the charity thing, and to keep it going.
Just reading some of the comments that people have been making there, and people were talking about the work and stress you've put up with over the years. They're saying that it's a surprise you've not got a grey head of hair.
I have. I've got a few, and I'd love to have some more. I'd be delighted to, distinguished and so on. It's just a bit sort of peppery. My beard, if I don't shave, is completely white. But however much stress I've subjected myself to, it's never done the job of giving me a white head of hair.
And some people are stating, that they're not sure about lawfare. People have sued the police and officials. Some people have been successful. Somebody's just mentioned a judicial review against the Welsh regional government, which just failed and ended up being very expensive for those bringing it forward. Not heard of that one.
Yeah, there is. It's a very good point there. I'd like to mention something here to support that person's point of view, really, that there's a huge number of people out there, not from the nationalist world, but more from the sort of the truther types and so on. They've got this, free man on the land Magna Carta stuff. Yes, and it sounds absolutely wonderful. It's nonsense. It's legal horseshit, and it leads people to all sorts of problems. Because yes, it's entirely true, apparently, that if you and I go on the walls of York later on this evening with a bow and arrow, and we shoot a Scotsman after dark, then we cannot be fine. It's perfectly fine, because the statute allowing that has never been revoked. Try it, and you will spend 20 years in prison for murder, and rightly so. And it's the same, the whole, in the end, the whole point about the law and politics. Chairman Mao was right. Political power and legal power comes out of the barrel of a gun. It comes out of policemen. It comes out of policemen's truncheons. It comes out of their pepper sprays. It comes out of their ability to throw you in prison, bankrupt you, and take your house away. It's all about force. And our rights under Magna Carta have no force whatsoever. And whatever the theory is, and I've seen it in actual practice, people convinced, they go before the judge, I refuse to recognise you, I'm within your rights.
Well, it does not work like that.
The judge says, I'm within my rights to send you down for 14 days till you purge your contempt. Take him away. And that's what they do. And some of the legal challenges, which of late have given people the idea that lawfare is another dead end, they've been thoroughly misconceived and encouraged by people who should know better, who are talking this ridiculous theoretical nonsense. You have to work within the existing laws, within the existing statutes, and if you can, even within the existing prejudices and preconceptions that the local elite have. You have to try and work with those to put ourselves, you can see, here's your definition of victims. We are victims. We're putting it right. It's going to be far more effective than standing on one of these hills, whether it's something particularly hardline, I want to talk at the JQ all day long, or insisting on my rights to shoot the Scotsman on the walls of York.
I mean, yes, I've heard quite a number of these, so I call them common law activists. I mean, common law is in force. Like, we have a constitutional common law right to unimpeded access to justice. That does still stand. Yes. However, in practice, and even admittedly by the courts, there is no access to justice for the average citizen because it's unaffordable. And they can't even access the legal databases that they would need to be able to put forward their claims. I mean, this is one of the issues which I'm wishing to fight in the near future, but I'm looking for methods to go about it. I mean, yes. So what I've gathered from what you said in the document that I read is really you're trying to put a warning out there. It seems to mostly young men who, naturally full of testosterone and rage at the world, get all excited and they want to start these political movements. They want to talk about the JQ. They want to talk about race. And, they talk about revolution, but these things are unlikely to take place. And you're trying to give them fair warning of what it involves. It will involve persecution. You're unlikely to get anywhere. It's a lot of expense and money. And trying to fight against a system which is, collapsing of its own accord seems a little bit silly. And what we should be focusing on is creating stronger community cohesion and links within the indigenous population, creating parallel societies, community groups, engaging in things possibly like lawfare, but ensuring that there is some sort of structure, an alternative structure for our own people to engage in society.
Exactly. And the thing is, lawfare, there's definitely a role for it, just as there's a role for electioneering for parish councils. But it's a valuable sideline. That's all it'll ever be. It might some successes may attract people. So that's really important. But then it's what you do with those people. And in the end, with the lawfare thing, some you'll win, some you'll lose. Whereas if you get a group of young people together and make it easier in many ways, just mutual support and exchanging cots and so on as babies get older. If you get a group of young family inclined people together and encourage them to get married and have kids, and make it slightly easier and provide support. And then also, crucially important, there's no point having kids if they're put through the state school system, if they're left slumped in front of their television and their internet and their music, and they'll come out at the age of 16, 17, completely turned against you, utterly brainwashed, and just part of the herd galloping towards its own destruction. You have to not only have children, you have to homeschool them. And you can't do that easily in one individual family, because kids naturally they need to play with other kids. When the leftists have always said, it takes a family to raise a village, it takes a village to raise a child. It's actually entirely true. So we have to create our villages, not necessarily geographically, although as the demographic crisis bites, it's becoming easier and easier to do that in more and more places of the world, including Western Europe, perfectly decent places. But it may not be a geographical set of families. I'm not talking about a commune, because that's thoroughly unnatural. I'm talking about individual free families owning or renting their own house, tilling their own little bit of land, keeping their own chickens, but then exchanging chickens and eggs for meat from someone who keeps pigs and so on, things like that. And these things you can do, and there is nothing that, whereas lawfare, some you'll win, some you'll lose. If you go down this basically just family breeding and keeping the kids on the right line, then you cannot lose. As long as you do it, then automatically you're succeeding. And even if your pigs die because you've fed them something you shouldn't have done, well, as long as you learn from that and you don't do it again, and everyone else in your network doesn't do it either, then you even learn from your failures. Whereas a failure in lawfare, you've lost your money, you've lost your case, bang, that's it. You've got no choice but to move on. So it's a really important part of it, as is, I would say, the charity shops for local communities, the spreading the Northern Ireland band culture and the local identity culture with flags and painted curbstones.
I think that's a very good idea.
Those things are all really, really important, but none of them is worth jack unless you're also encouraging every single one of your people who can have children to have children, and those who for one reason or other can't, to do things which in some way support the fact that this is a community which isn't just here for now. It's not just about trying to take power somewhere to make some political change in 5 or 10 years or 15 years time. It's about being the grandparents and the great grandparents of thousands of our people 100 years hence, because those are the ones who actually decide what emerges from the wreckage of the system that we now live under.
Nick, you're repeating the same thing to me that nationalists repeat to me all the time. As a woman of still fertile age that's yet to have kids, this is the main rant that people have at me constantly. So, you need to have some kids, Paris. That's the most important thing. And I will get round to it. We're working on it. But, I feel that there has to be something for them to grow up in. They have to have a sense of identity, a sense of community, a sense of safety and security and belonging. And, without that, I feel that we're just producing lambs for the slaughter. And I find it difficult as well. As a nationalist, if you're openly, as you say, it's about antagonistic, creating organizations like the White Indigenous Rights Alliance, the state will persecute you. And you worry about how that persecution might affect your family. So, if I will get around to it, but I think I'd probably end up having to take a bit of a back seat from what I'm doing now for their safety.
You might have to, certainly from the sort of thing you're doing now. But if it's about helping and encouraging other young mothers, then no one can do it like a young mother who's just a few months further down the line, as it were. And that is the most important thing. So I'll be very blunt, you can't leave it too long because you haven't got many years left.
I've got some volunteers and a nice gentleman who's that I've been seeing for a little while, so we'll see how that goes.
Can I also say one thing? I understand exactly where you're coming from. Will it be safe for those kids? Look, none of us would be here. Certainly there would be no white people in America, or for that matter in South Africa, for all the stress they're under. There wouldn't be an Oriania now, in a bit of South Africa showing what the place could be. None of those things would exist. The whole white population of the United States of America would not exist were it not for pioneers who went out to those places and had children, knowing that at any moment you can get a party of psychotic Stone Age Indians coming crashing through your door, rape everything, torture everything to death, and set fire to the place. So your duty, collectively, our duty to the future generation, first of all, is to have them. Otherwise, it's all for nothing anyway. So first of all, to have them, then to rear them right so that they don't go wrong from the inside. If something bad happens to them, it's because something from outside happens to them. And they might be persecuted. They might be persecuted in school. Some kids, that will break. Many of them, in the end, it'll make them tougher. We're not on this earth to be happy.
Or to be in too much comfort and being too soft.
Exactly. We are purely on this earth to replicate our genes and the culture and belief set that comes, and the history that comes with those genes, and replicate them and pass them on, and to encourage. There's a 2-generation responsibility. You're responsible for the next generation, and to a degree the one after that as grandparents. After that, you're not responsible for anything. And we certainly aren't responsible for the millions and millions of sheep, those stupid, moronic men of all classes who for the last 30, 40 years have spent vast amounts of money, vast amounts, including of blood and skin knuckles, fighting other fans of football teams, watching 22 overpaid, soft as shite tossers, many of them alien. Yes. Because I'm comparing that to, say, rugby. So they are soft and pathetic and childish and twisted. And they watch that, and they've happily allowed that monstrous bread and circuses farce to let them sit by while a million of our girls are being gang raped. So we are not responsible for those people and the fact that they are going to come to a horrible end in a collapsing society. Forget them. The only people we're responsible for is our children and our friends and our families. And that's all we need to have.
Oh, sorry, just moving my chair and it spun off by itself. So we've come to the end of an hour. I know we were planning to do an hour. I really wanted to talk about the Russia-Ukraine thing, but that will probably even take a whole other hour, the depleted uranium and being dragged into world wars. See, I don't even think the South Africa effect will have time. I don't think we're even going to get to the stage where, it's going to economic collapse, where they can't keep the electricity on, where we're eating the bugs and living in 15-minute cities, because we're looking at the possibility of nuclear war and World War III with the way that our globalist run governments are behaving at this time.
We really are. We really are. I think a lot of people don't understand it, and a lot of nationalists are so tied up with the stuff they sort of grown up thinking, which is about them and the Africans coming in and the grooming gangs and so on, that it's easy. I can understand it. It's easy to forget that there are bigger pictures and so on, and there's even bigger threats. Because if you're worried about the Muslim problem, then generally you can move away from the area. You might have to leave some friends behind. You might have to get another job. You might have to get a pay cut. But generally, you could leave and move away from the area. If you're that fussed about it, if you can raise 5 or 6 grand, you can go and buy a small farm, small holding somewhere in Hungary or in Poland or in Slovakia or in Portugal or southern Spain or whatever. And you can simply go completely native down there and just get into self-sufficiency and say, well, none of this, they're not coming near me here and my family here. There's all sorts of ways you can deal with that proper. You cannot deal with a nuclear war. We're all going to die most unpleasantly. And there's never been a time where we are now that's been closer to a full-on nuclear war than where we are now.
It seems that, doesn't it? I mean, like we were saying before.
Yeah.
The global elite have really lost the plot. I don't know what's going on with Putin. I've not picked any sides. I mean, the way that I see it is the war with Russia and Ukraine. It's bad for both. It's just bad for white people. It's bad for the world altogether. The only people that seem to profit from the wars are Jews. But the insanity of how quickly it's escalating in the matter of such a short space of time over a patch of land that isn't even that valuable.
Yeah, well, I would say that a couple of things there. First of all, plenty of people benefit from wars, particularly the super rich WASP military industrial complex.
Yes,
super rich WASPs, as well as crazed white-hating Jews. So there's plenty of people benefit from it. And politicians benefit from puffing and preening and thinking that they've got their place on the world stage. I actually have a theory, I won't go into it any length now, but I have a theory that we're actually genetically determined for old men in power to favour wars. Yes. Because if you're an old man in the tribe, which is how we are evolved in recent historical times, if you're an old man in the tribe in power and you go to war against another tribe, one of two things is going to happen. Either you win and then you get sex slaves from the other tribe, or you lose and most of your young men are killed. And guess what then?
You get their wives.
Either way, the old men get their last chance at genetic immortality. So I think that that's part of what goes on with war. So there's always a risk. And actually, up until now, nuclear war has been so unthinkable that it's held that at bay. But we're now dealing with this crazed elite who are happily rolling the dice of nuclear war. Like almost all the major wars, it was a forced war. Russia had no choice but to go to war. When NATO had got a proxy army of about 150,000 strong, about to go in and complete the genocide, which already been going on for 8 years, of purely Russian speakers in what is historically Russia, Russia couldn't possibly accept that. It would have been suicide for Putin and everyone else around him. It would have been wrong for Russia. So war was forced on them. So that's the first thing. It's a forced war. But secondly, I think that they've perhaps got a bit used to it, and it's a long way away. And yes, our taxes shouldn't be going to it. And it seems rather ridiculous that we've now not got a single howitzer in the British Army, and its artillery wins wars of conventional ones. We haven't got a single howitzer left because we've given them all to Ukraine. Actually, doesn't matter because we haven't got any ammunition for them either. But we've got beyond that because Britain right now is giving depleted uranium warheads to, well, they're only shells. They're tank busters, and they're very effective at destroying tanks. But the problem with depleted uranium rounds is that they also pollute. Well, it gives them extra power, so they're more effective. But okay, well, that's war, isn't it? But no, it's far worse than that. The clue's in the word uranium. Depleted it may be, but it's radioactive. It's radioactive. It's seriously radioactive. And Britain and the USA and our other stinking rotten allies fired an awful lot of these, especially in the Fallujah area of Iraq during the equally outrageous and unjust Iraq War. And as a result, today, Iraqi children are being born with the most appalling deformities. And Iraqis all ages are dying of the most ghastly cancers because we deliberately polluted a part of their country. And this is no longer the British or the American elite, the NATO elite, saying we might do these things. They are already doing that. We are now waging a dirty nuclear bomb war in a part of Russia. That's what we're doing. And so it's a massive escalation, and the Russians will escalate in return. The only question is how. They may do something which thoroughly screws our economy. They could destroy the dollar as an international reserve currency simply by selling off all their dollar holdings. But they take a big hit doing that as well, so they might not do that. But they can either impose enormous extra economic pain on the West, which will feed into all sorts of other problems, or they're quite entitled to say, well, you've escalated the war, you're poisoning our people, and you, Mr. Sunak, are one of those responsible. They're quite entitled to send a Kinzhal missile over and just obliterate Downing Street. It's just one of those things. Now, if they did that, Britain then, or the whole West, then has one choice: retaliate with nuclear weapons and destroy the world, or surrender. I'm not sure what they do. I think quite possibly they'd surrender.
I think they'd probably destroy the world.
It's a hell of a risk.
Yeah.
And so we had to hope the Russians won't do that. But they might feel that they have to, because what else do you do with people who are deliberately poisoning your future generations and destroying part of your land so you simply cannot use it again? And it doesn't matter whether it's valuable or not. And there's important mineral reserves in parts of the contested areas and so on. It doesn't really matter whether it's valuable or not, does it? It's a part of their country and it's their people, and they are being forced from their country with nuclear warfare. And if you look probably at what happened in the end with the whole COVID thing, I think it's pretty clear that it came from a Chinese lab. It doesn't mean the Chinese were to blame. That was a CIA laboratory working on gain of function enhancements to diseases with a view, almost certainly, to use them against China. So the Chinese or the Russians might suddenly, rightly or wrongly, think, well, they're not only poisoning us with nuclear stuff, they've just around the corner, they've got a biological bomb as well. We've got to hit them before they hit us. That's how dangerous things are. You're at the stage when a simple rumour, a simple misunderstanding could get us all killed, and our elite keep on winding it up. On this, I don't know, what can we do about it? Sooner or later, all the truthers who, I think everyone who's been involved in the anti-lockdown and the even now the traffic protests and so on, they nearly all seem to get, you look at the papers like The Light and so on, they all seem to get the bigger picture. Therefore, they're against this war. They're certainly against our involvement in this war. I think it's time that some of them, not me, because that'll be the kiss of death, me at the front of it, but it's time that some of those people started to organise really mass protests, a proper grassroots anti-war campaign, and some of the left will join it. George Galloway will join it, and there's others on the left. Plenty of the left won't. They'll be there with Antifa operating as the state's plausibly deniable boot boys to try and smash it up. But okay, if these days Antifa is 50 or 100 utterly bizarre LGBT, particularly T freaks, and again, if they come up against ordinary people, they get a hiding. So let's have it. But I think that it's time for everyone who understands that war is deeply dangerous as well as deeply wrong to start getting out in the streets and protesting about it and against it.
Yes, I believe it's one of the most important issues that we should be standing against. The only problem is that people have been brainwashed, and we've seen it with the COVID. I mean, if they're not waving an LGBT flag, it's I support Ukraine. It's like it's the new thing. It's the new thing. So, I can imagine that there will be counter protests to an anti-war protest now. But
possibly so, but it's very difficult for people. I think it'd be very difficult for people nowadays to come out from the liberal left and start from themselves. It's difficult to come out demanding war, demanding profits for the global corporations. So they might, and I think a year ago there were Ukrainian flags all over the country. Now there's virtually none. There's still Ukrainian flags as people's avatars and so on social media, but I think quite a few of those are probably 77th Brigade operations. It's all smoke and mirrors. Most people, at least, I think to run a campaign saying victory for Putin, because Putin's right, that'd be difficult. But to say, and it's the old British nationalist position from Mosley onwards, Britain's fight for Britain only. This is not our war. We shouldn't be involved. Don't send our taxes, and don't risk getting us all nuked in someone else's quarrel. And I think that would resonate.
I think it would. So, Nick, we are coming to after just 1:15. Yep. I would love to be able to continue the conversation, but I don't know if you're going to be busy into the evening. If you have any closing points, I mean, I wanted to say about your time and how, to analyse whether your time has been wasted in politics. I know you've given up in party politics, but I don't think that it has been. I mean, I think that you've saved lives with your trip to Syria, where you convinced David Cameron to not declare war. I think with nationalism as a whole, it would have completely collapsed without your influence and the BNP at that time. I think that the BNP had a big role in bringing about the referendum and Brexit. Mm-hmm. But what are your thoughts on it?
That we didn't achieve anything of what we really intended to achieve, except for the fact that even before I joined the National Front, when I was about 12, it was just after Britain had joined it must have been 14 actually, stood in the ruins of a field in Suffolk, where the hedges had been bulldozed and the fish and tadpole filled pond that me and my friends used to fish in was being filled in, and everything was destroyed, everything that was dead, a film of oil and all these dead fish lying there. And I made this boyish oath to, in some way, get revenge on what was then the common market and the people who'd done this. And it became the European Union. And as you said, I'm absolutely convinced that if it wasn't for the way in which Farage was boosted in order to block us, that UKIP would not have had the enormous political influence and the threat it had over the Tory party. Cameron wouldn't have needed to offer a referendum. Therefore, there wouldn't have been a referendum. 3 or 4 years down the line, it would have gone the other way for pure demographic reasons. So it was the last moment that the Get Britain Out people could win And we did win that. And even though we all knew, certainly I knew, I guess you knew as well, that we weren't going to get what we wanted,
No.
which was control our borders to keep all of them out, not just swap the ones we're getting in. We knew we weren't going to get that, but still it was damn good to get it. And that was worth it. So that I achieved. And I guess I did get my revenge on the common market for poisoning my fishing pond anyway. Then on the other thing, the David Cameron and Syria. Very briefly there, what happened, because I didn't convince David Cameron not to bomb Syria. I've been to Syria several times, and they've been convinced because I did an interview which was never shown with the BBC. And the BBC, the day afterwards, changed their position and started telling people that actually Assad had quite a lot of support. They were convinced that I was really good at propaganda and so on. So when Cameron came up with this proposal to bomb Syria, they asked would I go over there and help them write the letter that they would write, not to Cameron, but to all the members of parliament, explaining why it'd be a bad idea to bomb them. And they enough self-awareness to understand that if they wrote it their Arab way, if you bomb us, our grandsons will still be castrating your grandsons in 90 years' time and will hang your guts over camels to dry, the Arab sort of way, that wouldn't have gone down well. So they asked me to come and write the letter as a British parliamentarian, educated with these vermin and all the rest of it, and that's what we did. So I wrote the letter that the Speaker of the Syrian Parliament sent to every member of the British Parliament. And the man who actually stopped that war was Miliband, leader of the Labour Party, despite being Jewish. Fair play. He had a 3-line Labour whip to say all Labour MPs had to vote against the war. But Cameron had a small majority. And it was, in the end, there was a majority against the war of 14 votes. And that was the result of 7 Conservative MPs rebelling against their 3-line whip and voting against the war. And according to the BBC analysing it, they said that this, what they called a remarkable letter, was the thing which had persuaded those handful of MPs that they could vote in their own conscience, that they could vote the other way, that they were dealing with reasonable people. That meant that Cameron couldn't start bombing Syria, which then meant that Obama, who didn't really want to bomb Syria anyway, for different reasons, then had an excuse not to. So therefore, Syria survived in a way that Libya didn't, as a result of which he didn't get the extermination of the last Christians in the Middle East, and he didn't get the basically culmination of the Yinon plan to destroy every state around Israel so that Israel was the last one standing. So it's a major turning point in global affairs, and that's possible because thousands of British National Party activists sacrificed money, jobs, time, marriages, everything in order to get me elected. So it did do something.
It did. And again, thank you so much to all of those unsung heroes that are the activists of political parties that invest their time, money, and energy. A lot of the time, the people who, like Farage, whose face is on camera, that get all of the recognition for what's taken place. And I really do respect you for pointing out that there was a lot of people who invested time, money, energy, sacrificed a lot to make it possible for you to go on and do what you've done for other people. So good. No, it's a good thing to do.
Now, I really need to go because I've got some grandchildren downstairs abandoned.
Yes, we've gone 23 minutes over time.
And I need to go and rescue them. Can I just say, finally, thank you very much for having me on. I'd love to hear from you later on about some of the feedback, some of the questions, and perhaps come back and address some of those questions, prickly ones as well as soft ones, to another show if you're happy back in due course. And if Chris will have us both back. Thanks very much to Chris. Can I just say that anyone wants to follow me further, I'm on Telegram, I'm on Twitter as well. I don't know how still, but I'm free and unfettered on Telegram. So follow me, t.me/Nick Griffin. And in particular, pinned there now, I've got one of the most important documents I've ever written, which is just called Arrested, which is what you must do if you're arrested by the police, and you're all liable to be. If you're watching this show, then you're involved in something which makes you a potential target for the politically correct police force and the state. And they're the experts. And unless you've read this document, you'll end up talking yourself into prison. So it's really, really important to get that document. As I say, it's pinned right now on my Telegram channel. Come and have a look and take it from there. And thanks very much for listening.
Thank you for coming on, Nick. It's been a pleasure. I've read that just before we went to Dover. Any of you that are planning to go to Wakefield, you might want to give that a read, along with the No Electoral Route document. I believe it's out there somewhere, but that's a very interesting piece of work as well. But yes, Nick, I will let you get back to your grandchildren. It's been a pleasure having you on, and hopefully we'll get to continue this conversation at an alternative date, possibly with Chris with us once he's back.
Smashing, Kate. Thank you very much.
Oh, and all the comments seem to have been very positive. There hasn't been any anti-Katie or anti-Nick trolls in the chat at all, which I'm surprised about. But yes, pleasure to have you.
Have the trolls. Been great. Thanks so much. Good night.
Good night. Ending broadcast.